Dear colleagues, everybody, good afternoon. Very happy to see you. We'll start now the press conference by the Governor of the Bank of Russia, Elvira Nabiullina, and the Deputy Governor, Alexei Zabotkin. And to start with, we will hear from the Governor based on the results of the Board of Directors meeting. Good afternoon. Today, the Bank of Russia has decided to keep the key rate at 7.5% per annum. The major trends observed over recent months remain. The current growth rates of consumer prices are still decreased, and annual inflation is decelerating. The economy continues to adapt to the current changes. However, there are new factors that might have a pro-inflationary effect in the medium term. In the first place, these are escalating geopolitical tensions, partial mobilization, and a worsening situation in the world economy. Considering this, our decision to keep the key rate unchanged appears to be most balanced. I would now dwell on the reasons behind this decision. Firstly, inflationary pressure currently remains decreased. A slight acceleration of price growth in September versus August was primarily caused by one-off factors, namely higher rates in auto insurance and mobile communications. Net of them, pressure on prices will be below 4% in annualized terms. We still observe a downward adjustment of prices for consumer goods that became much more expensive in spring. These are construction materials, furniture, electronics, and some food products. Nevertheless, price growth is still gradually accelerating overall compared to very low figures in May, June, and July. Monthly price growth is expected to be notably high in December, largely due to the pass-through of the indexation of utility tariffs to December. This will increase annual inflation by about 0.5 percentage points this year. Companies' price expectations continued to go up. Households' inflation expectations remain elevated. However, we still do not observe any rise in consumer activity. Saving behavior might be explained by elevated uncertainty. Besides, consumer might still continue to adjust to the changed range of goods. A new factor influencing price trends is partial mobilization. In the coming months, it will have a disinflationary effect because of lower consumer demand. Nonetheless, later on, it might start to have a pro-inflationary impact due to changes in the structure of the labor market and the shortage of some specialty skills. It is now difficult to assess all economic consequences of the shift in the structure of employment. They will manifest themselves gradually through the adjustment in wages and the possible intensification of the transfer of labor forces across industries and regions. The inflation forecast for this year has been adjusted to 12 to 13%, whereas that for the next year remains unchanged, namely 5 to 7%. Inflation will return to its target of close to 4% in 2024. Secondly, as the economy has been adapting to the external restrictions more quickly, the decline in GDP in 2022 will be less significant than assumed in the middle of the year. This is associated with a more positive situation in the third quarter, owing to industrial production and the agricultural sector expecting a record high harvest this year. Trends in agriculture are covered separately in October report regional economy box that we are preparing. Considering this, we have improved our GDP forecast for this year and believe that the contraction of the economy will be 3 to 3.5%. Nevertheless, according to recent data, economic activity started to decline again in September after its stabilization in summer. This might be caused by a weaker consumer demand and worse conditions for Russian exports, amongst other reasons. Heterogeneity across industries and regions remains. After the suspension of operation in spring, the domestic automobile industry has started to recover. The output of medicines and some types of agricultural machinery is expanding at a double-digit pace. There are considerable changes happening in transportation. International cargo traffic has been largely redirected to Far Eastern seaports, with their share in sea container transportation growing from 40% to 70%. The carrying capacity of the railways leading to these seaports has become of paramount importance. Their overload might hinder exports on the one hand and restrain the increase in imports from Asia on the other hand. There are some coal producers, oil refineries and petrochemical plants for which the redirection of supplies to the east remains a serious logistical problem. Difficulties with sales are forcing individual companies to reduce their output. In our updated forecast, we have kept Ural's crude price in 2023 to 2025 unchanged at the level of 70, 60 and 55 US dollars per barrel, respectively. On the one hand, this estimate takes into account the worsened forecast for the world economy, including higher risk of a recession. As a result, global demand for commodities, including Russian oil, might contract. On the other hand, the OPEC Plus countries have taken measures to cut the oil production quotas. We believe that these factors are offsetting each other. The recovery growth of the economy next year will start slightly later than assumed in July. The economy will reach the bottom of the decline in the middle of next year. Demand from the public sector will continue to support economic activity. The forecast of GDP for the next year has remained unchanged. It will shrink by 1 to 4% and resume an upward trend in the fourth quarter. I would like to say a few words about the balance of payments. We have slightly raised the forecast of exports and imports for this year. The forecast of the current account surplus has increased by 10 billion to 253 billion US. Further on, over the forecast horizon, imports will be bouncing back as companies find new supplies and arrange mechanisms of settlements and logistics, whereas exports may be contracting due to the external restrictions. As a result, the current account surplus will be decreasing as well. The path of this decline is approximately in line with our July forecast. Thirdly, monetary conditions have remained neutral overall. However, they have slightly toughened after the September board meeting despite the key rate reduction. The main reason was intensifying geopolitical tensions. As a result, yields on federal government bonds, especially long-term ones, have edged up. Besides, banks have raised their deposit rates in response to the outflow of cash. As to credit rates, they have stopped declining. Concurrently, banks have increased their requirements for borrowers. This is evident from a lower share of approved loan applications. Ultimately, there are signs of a slowdown in lending in October. Nonetheless, credit activity is still high now in both the retail and corporate segments. The growth of corporate loans in rubles is partly associated with the replacement of foreign currency loans and external financing. Considering the current trends, we have raised our forecast for lending to the economy to 9-12%. This rate will remain nearly the same in the next few years. I will now speak on the risks that might cause a deviation from the baseline forecast. Pro-inflationary risks have risen over the mid-term horizon. As regards external conditions, the situation in the world economy is deteriorating. Many countries were pursuing accommodative monetary policy for a long period, thus creating an overhang of cheap credit in the economy. Such policy has caused imbalances that are inevitable in this case, exacerbating risks to financial stability in global markets. Responding to high inflation, many countries have raised their policy rates abruptly, which also has negative implications, as this will hinder the growth of the world economy and increase debt servicing costs. This is aggravated by the effects of the fragmentation in global markets and the escalation of geopolitical tensions. A further intensification of the crisis process worldwide and the expansion of the sanctions imply a shift towards a more considerable shrinkage in Russian exports and a potential weakening of the ruble, which might cause pro-inflationary effects. As regards internal conditions, important risks for us still include further changes in inflation expectations and the possible impact of their elevated level on households' saving behavior. Moreover, pro-inflationary risks associated with the labor market have risen. An increase in staff shortages is strengthening companies' competition for employees and pushing up wages that might grow faster than labor productivity. A considerable group of risks is related to supply-side factors. Enterprises are gradually tackling the problems with maintaining current operations, but investments in the development might be hampered by both overall uncertainty and difficulties with equipment purchases and deliveries. This means that supply might be recovering more slowly in the future. There are three groups of factors that might have disinflationary effects. First of all, households might continue to prefer savings. Second, a record high harvest expected in agriculture this year might have an impact on prices in the domestic market amid persistent difficulties with exports. Third, this is a faster rebound in imports of consumer and intermediate goods. Generally, disinflationary factors are weaker than pro-inflationary ones over the forecast horizon. Our forecast relies on the already published parameters of the draft budget for the next 3 years. The predictability of fiscal policy and a consistent reduction in the structural budget deficit over the forecast horizon are essential assumptions behind the monetary policy path presented in the forecast. Winding up, I would like to comment on our future decisions. Obviously, the Russian economy is experiencing a deep transformation. Consumers are changing their behavior strategies, and businesses are adapting to the new challenges. The events and risks that have occurred over the past months might have mixed effects on the economy and prices. As we receive data on the economic development in these conditions, we will additionally adjust our estimates of those effects and their impact on the forecast. Our decisions will aim to return inflation to the 4% target in 2024. Thank you for your attention. Now, dear colleagues, we are going over to the Q&A. Don't forget to introduce yourselves and also identify agency. Nastya, please. Good afternoon. Anastasia Savelyev from Interfax Agency. Traditional question, what kind of options were put on the table in terms of the rate? Has the bank considered bringing it up or bringing it down? And in September, you also mentioned about the narrow boundaries for the further rate decline. Can you be starting to say now that it has exhausted itself and the slightly worse monetary conditions might also push you towards a tougher monetary policy in the future? This time we had a very broad consensus as to our decision that the rate should be kept unchanged. As far as our further action is concerned, we're of the mind that the monetary policy currently is in a neutral range, and we also sent a neutral signal. What it means is that the further trajectory of the key rate and the further direction of our monetary policy will be dependent upon the data we receive about economics, inflationary expectations, and depending upon the kind of factors that might outweigh it, possibly the rate may remain unchanged as well as be brought up or down, which means that our signal currently is neutral. Dear colleagues, please, Rita, second question. Good afternoon, Rita Shaklevskaya from TASS Agency. Your presentation on the monetary policy was very detailed, so I would allow myself a question about something different. And specifically, what is the current phase that the process to fight for the frozen reserves, in subject of risks, is currently at? In media, there emerged various speculations about a bubble in the mortgage market. I would like you to possibly comment on these two things, please. As far as our work about the frozen assets is concerned, I multiple times said that it's a very intricate, very complex work, so it is underway, but it's premature to offer any comments just now. And as far as mortgage is concerned, an important segment, and we do see that starting from 2020, a trend has emerged here whereby the housing price growth was ahead of the nominal household income growth. The second important trend is that the primary housing market price growth was ahead of the secondary market price growth, and so that gap has grown, and we see that this could be an indirect precursor of a certain overheating in the housing market. Specifically, we felt strong concerns, and we were outspoken about it, the way the subsidized mortgage was being offered from the developers, which could in turn lead to a bubble growing in the mortgage market. Currently, we do acknowledge a certain cooling down of the mortgage market against this uncertainty. The number of mortgage applications has decreased, and at the same time, the market offerings for housing available in the secondary market is growing along with the discounts, which could redirect the demand from the primary to the secondary market and generally may facilitate the prices staying as they are. But to our mind, in order to avoid such risk, the bubbles and overheating, it is important to develop customer-specific support programs rather than over-the-counter ones which could create disbalancy and rather than lead to a great availability of housing, instead of that, to prices skyrocketing. Thanks very much. Rita, next question. Margarita Mordovina, RBK Agency. The first question is going to be about the Odkrytie, the discovery deal that is currently being prepared, as viewed by the evaluators, is 386 billion rubles, but at the same time, the head of the VTB, Mr. Kosting, was saying that the question of price is still to be discussed and other issues are being cleared through the central bank. What do you think? Is the Central Bank of Russia ready to sell Odkrytie below the valuation, and whether at all the price issue is debatable? And my second question, on October 15th, a decree was signed that the central bank was given the authority to issue permission to export hard currency in excess of 10,000. Now, who the recipients of such permits could be, for what purposes, have there been any applications for such permits by now? Thank you very much. As far as Odkrytie is concerned, yes, the valuation is coming to its end. But there hasn't been any formal report yet submitted. But even if when it comes, we're not commenting on the valuations, and undoubtedly we will enter into discussion with the buyers as to the price. These discussions will be organized, and in any case, we intend to close this deal before the end of the year. So the discussion is going to take place very shortly, but of course on the basis of the proper valuations being disclosed. And the second one, yes, and as far as our authority under the above-mentioned decree is concerned to issue permits for the exports of hard currency in excess of 10,000, yes, we've been vested with such an authority, but in the meantime, to raise the restrictions limiting the exports of cash by citizens, we don't have it because our access to cash hard currency is limited. The non-cash is coming slower in terms of our commodity exports returns, and we will see how it goes. Fyodor Ivanov, Invest Future. Good afternoon. I've got two questions. The first one is there is positive news from Russian investors that some of the assets are going to be unfrozen, about 10% of it, and so it would be nice to find out whether there are any possible response measures being considered to unblock and possibly sell assets by non-residents from unfriendly countries, maybe in the same volume, or maybe there are some sort of stories which might look like a reaction to it. And my second question with respect to what you have just mentioned, the geopolitical risks and their effect on the lending rates. What is the way that the central bank currently views the impact of the lower central rate on the economy against the banks toughening their requirements they place upon the borrowers and maintain high rate levels because they simply are afraid that these loans might not be returned? As far as your first question is concerned, indeed, such information, private financial institutions are working to unfreeze the frozen assets of our retail investors through trying to receive licenses, through litigation, through negotiations. But it hasn't yet happened, and so in terms of our response measures, we'll see how it goes. As far as the geopolitical risks are concerned and their impact upon the lending rate and overall the lending activity, it is true that despite the fact that in September we reduced the key rate, lately the lending rates have grown, but this reflects a higher risk premium because through our key rate we influence the short-term rates, the money market rates, and after that, the rates for specific borrowers, the market rates are not being administered. They take into account such risk, the overall risk in the economy, but also the risk of an individual borrower, his or her income, the cash flow, the indebtedness, and certainly the banks currently have reassessed the level of the market level risks, bringing them up, because we do notice this in a slowdown in the lending activity, but we will see how it impacts inflation, and if need be, we'll further specify our monetary policy to bring it in line. Svetlana, please. Good afternoon. Svetlana Orlik, RIA Novosti. Two questions. As deemed by the Bank of Russia, should there be a need for any additional measures to balance exports and imports? And what kind of measures this could be? And has the Bank of Russia considered a potential impact on the Russian GDP from the recent OPEC plus reductions, as well as the introduction of the European embargo on the Russian crude? What regards is it saying imports, exports, balancing? The import and export flow changes currently depend upon the way they're being redirected towards our other end markets, as well as unbundling of various logistical issues and the bottlenecks in infrastructure that there are, as well as organizing the payment system. These are the important things which currently affect imports and exports with external restrictions in the background. As far as the financial part of it is concerned, we continue to believe that the floating rate is the best way to balance the interests of the exporters and importers under the current circumstances. As far as the potential effect from embargo and from the OPEC plus decisions and from the price caps, right? I believe that all the consequences are not being imagined by anybody specifically in terms of what their totality is going to look like, but nevertheless, what is important to us, that these consequences can be very diverse and to stay conservative in terms of our crude forecast, because if you take a look at our forecast, we were conservative in July, we're remaining conservative now. We keep our expectations for the crude prices in the future, like the case was in July, because there were two different factors. On the one hand, OPEC Plus, but on the other hand, the possible demand decline for the Russian energy, both under the influence of the global economy growth rates declining and various export restrictions. So it is very important for us to remain balanced and conservative. Can you add something? Well, the only thing that, of course, the sanctions impact upon the GDP. I mean, all the sanctions have been reflected in the forecast. There is, in effect, so in the prerequisites to the forecast is expected that it's going to be less than what basically we would see towards the end of 2022. Dear colleagues, the next question comes from online. Andrei Pushkarev from Vladivostok newspaper. Currently, the level of inflation practically doesn't correlate to the key rate. Effectively, every indicator lives the life of their own. What is in the way for a more dynamic rate reduction? Well, in my answer to the previous question, I began saying that we've got the key rate role, and it is such that in the first place it impacts the short-term rate rather than the market rate is under the impact of other factors like risk premium and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, the key rate is a very effective tool to control inflation. I can give you this year's February example, when the inflation expectations dramatically skyrocketed, and it was the bringing up of the key rate which became the main driver, as the result of which it was possible to cool the inflationary trends down and to re-establish financial stability. You are asking why one can't reduce the rate more dynamically, but I should say that we've been quite dynamic in bringing it down, because in February it was 20%, currently it is 7.5%, so this is 1 percentage point below than it was in the beginning of the year, and 2 percentage points lower than it was in February. So we're being quite active in our reductions, but the further rate dynamics will depend upon what happens in the economy with the inflationary processes, and another important factor is inflationary expectations. Dear colleagues, next one. Masha, please. Maria Kudryavtseva, Russia 24. Elvira Nabiullina. My question is about developing joint payment systems with Turkey and Iran, particularly after the problems that happened to our Mir card in these countries. So how it is going now? And the most important question is when this system could be fully operational. Yes, indeed, we experience difficulties under the influence of sanctions. Our partners are afraid of the secondary sanctions impact when supporting such payment instruments, but we are doing work with all of our partners. It is being organized differently with an individual country because every country is specific. We're not commenting on the details, but we're trying to establish various alternative ways for our citizens who often go on a travel or business to other countries so that they could use modern payment methods. Colleagues, yes, Katya in the last row, please. Yes, thank you. Reuters. I wanted to ask two sets of issues, if I may. The first one is about the banking sector. Today, it became known that Citibank is divesting from its consumer loans to Uralsib, and many other banks with foreign participation are in the list that was published this week, that there should be a special permit issued so that any transactions where the charter capital of this bank could take place. So my question is this: what are going to be the criteria for foreign banks, or for rather foreign shareholders, to get a permit to sell their subsidiaries? And the Citibank example doesn't mean that one can divest from one's assets without such a permit, but just piecemeal. And my third question in this set, if I may, do you see the risks that probably some of the banks from this list could be bailed bailed out simply because the parent banks will stop funding them. And yet another question in a different area. You mentioned that mobilization might have a pro-inflationary effect because of the labor force shortages. Do you have any preliminary assessment in your sort of basis points in terms of how much mobilization may add to inflation? As far as Russian subsidiaries of the foreign banks' operations are concerned, we treat them as Russian banks, and the whole regulation and the supervisory activity is skewed in the same way. But indeed, the transactions with assets in terms of the list do require special permission. Such criteria hasn't yet been established because work is ongoing over such a decree. It is difficult to say specifically. I would say that the whole range of factors is going to be considered. Now, in terms of there being any specific need to bail anybody out, I do not really see it. There aren't any such cases that might call for this in the foreseeable future because overall the banking sector is stable. Now, in terms of the possibility to sell assets, this decree covers only the transactions with stocks. As far as the impact from mobilization and different pro-inflationary factors are concerned, in the very beginning I mentioned that it is quite cumbersome to come up with a precise definition. We will have to rely upon the information which comes. In the short term, this would create disinflationary effect. Long-term, pro-inflationary effects. Maybe Alexander Borisovich will add something. Well, actually, it's difficult to add anything because the forecast speaks for itself. I mean, in terms of the inflation for the current year, it has been shifted slightly upwards and made a little bit more precise, and so this upward and edging up means that the tariffs in the indexation of the tariffs from July next year are being moved towards December, while the rest of the factors have balanced out. As far as the next year is concerned, you can see that our inflation forecast hasn't changed, so our base forecast is that the aggregate impact by all changes which have occurred since July upon inflation is approximately neutral. But without doubt, at this point in time, this is what the experts view rather than any specific econometric extrapolation from the past cases. And upon all of the subsequent board meetings, we will further specify all such positions. Next question comes online. Zhenya Pismina from Bloomberg, please. Hello. I've got two questions. One more specific about what was recently asked about the balancing of exports and imports. There appeared information in the media that the government agencies are discussing various ways to go about or restricting exports because they're not able to grow imports as fast as desired. Now, is Central Bank involved in these discussions? If positive, what do you think about this idea? And generally, whether such a restriction may produce the necessary outcome? Have you taken a look at this modeling at all? And my second question about the new regions. How the integration of the new regions is taking place into the original Central Bank of Russia integration? Have the central bank's representatives in the new territories participated in the discussion of the new key rates, like the other regions as well? As far as the balancing of the exports and imports are concerned, I do not know. I didn't participate in the discussions which would concern any administrative export restrictions in order to balance exports and imports. In my mind, this doesn't make sense to do, but something that one should consider is when exports are greater than imports and the ability to accumulate reserve assets are limited, there shouldn't be any measures to artificially facilitate exports additionally. That is the only way you should go about it. Would you like to add something about this? No. Dear colleagues, the next question, please. Olga. Going back on the mortgage issue, during the previous press conference, we've spoken about the 0.1% mortgage. Currently, there's a new phenomenon in the mortgage lending market. This is the mortgage with a monthly installment of 1 ruble until the housing asset has been commissioned into operation, and during that period, no interest is being charged on the principal. This is some kind of a new phenomenon in the mortgage market. So my question is, what do you think? How do you view such mortgage program? Because it really created an explosion of demand. Yes, indeed, this is a new product. We are attentively analyzing all of its consequences. We described it as a tranched mortgage. So far, it hasn't gained a very broad popularity, but in terms of the kind of risks that we may identify here, first of all, that could pose a risk to a developer. Why? Because in such a tranched mortgage, there will be less money coming to the escrow account, only the startup payment and a very symbolic first tranche. And so the escrow account is going to be filled slower than that in the regular mortgage, but we also see that the filling of the escrow accounts enables the banks to reduce the lending rates with respect to the loans to developers, because they have this collateral, and so the lending to developers remains lower than the average corporate sector lending, and so that may raise the lending rate in the case of a project finance case. Now, the second thing that it may lead to is a high demand for housing as a means to invest. That indeed could be attractive for speculative purposes. So individuals and companies may invest into housing for the purposes of their later remarketing. So this investment overhang may appear, which may push up the speed of housing being sold for investment purposes, which in its turn would further increase the gap between the price dynamics in the primary and the secondary markets. This is something that we already note, and that could create a problem, is this gap between the primary and the secondary markets. I mean, for the purpose of servicing a mortgage, because when somebody needs to sell a housing which is collateralized, it in the secondary market would be very different price-wise from that in the primary market. So there could be a bit of a mis-selling when people will respond to a low cost of servicing a loan in the original period while the building or the housing is not yet commissioned, without being fully aware of how much they will need to spend when servicing such a loan in the future. So this risk remains. We will continue analyzing them, and as need be, we will make respective decisions in the regulatory area. Dear colleagues, next one, Ivan, please. Good afternoon, Ivan Schligging, Formac Room. A few quick questions, a couple of questions. The first one, currently many experts started talking about the good experience of the 1940s when one had to switch to the mobilization economic model in order to deal with the risks. How well justified such views are? Do you think one should switch to such a model, and is it possible principally? My second question about the private investors who split themselves into two groups. One believes that currently anything should be sold while it is still possible and the exchange is still operational, while the other group is saying, just look at how cheap everything is, and so you've got to run your heads over heels and buy the commodity companies because they haven't been at such a low level in the past. So how correct these two groups of investors are? Well, as far as your first question is concerned, this country's economy is indeed facing new tasks, but I would like to note that the old tasks haven't gone anywhere, and we indeed have come into the period of very serious structural transformation that many factors impact. I'm not going even to list them. And based on my very deep conviction, such transformation can succeed only on the basis of the market economy. economy. Without doubt, the government must support such structural changes, unbundle the difficult places and bottlenecks in this structure, exactly something that the government is currently doing. However, the redistribution of resources into the more effective industries and sectors and enterprises, of course, should be done exclusively on the market principles. And actually we see that the economy has much better adjusted itself to these restrictions since February, much faster and better than anyone expected, in many ways thanks to the fact that the adjustment mechanisms were purely market-based. So I have no doubt about it. The second question, as far as different strategies and different approaches by private investors, they're always different. Indeed, there are such investors who invest when the market reaches the bottom. Others continue to divest. But I would like to say that the possibilities to invest despite certain limitations and restrictions, primarily because of the unfriendly countries in terms of the class of assets and using the infrastructure, are there. But the set of investment tools remains very broad, and of course private investors can decide on an informed basis where to invest and what kind of portfolios to maintain. The next question from Novosibirsk, Evgenia Dergachova, OTC Courtside. Evgenia, please. Good afternoon. The question about the frozen golden currency reserve was raised, but I would like to continue because several times I heard experts saying that since it is so difficult to return these frozen assets back into the economy, why doesn't central bank issue a respective equivalent amount in rubles so that this money could make their way back into the economy? Well, maybe I should start by reminding us of the story. When the golden hard currency reserves were being amassed and the Bank of Russia bought hard currency from exporters previously, new rubles were released into the circulation. And the fact that subsequently these acquired assets were frozen in no way influences the destiny of the rubles that the central bank used to pay for the hard currency it purchased, because importers used these rubles to and exporters used to these rubles to pay for wages and whatever. So there's no need to issue rubles in order to return these rubles back into the economy. These rubles never made it anywhere outside of the Russian economy. Marina, please. Marina Pimenova, NTV Business News Program. My question is about the exchange rate, rather about the ability to exchange cash in some of the banks in terms of the buying and selling of different currencies, almost twice different, buying 40, selling 75. Now the question is, does the central bank intend anything to do about it, and whether the regulator is worried by such a big difference? Well, I mean, the foreign exchange spreads cash are large, and that reflects the fact that we have encountered very serious restrictions in terms of the currency cash coming into the country. So here the banks establish these spreads themselves, depending upon how much citizens are willing to sell or to buy such currencies. We're not intending to meddle into this, because that enables to balance the demand and supply of cash currency by businesses and households. The next question comes from online, Tatiana Voronova, Frank Media. Please, Tatiana. Thank you. Good afternoon. I got two questions. In the first half year, the banking system worked into the red. We remember there's 1.5 trillion. Now, as far as the second half year is concerned, amongst other things, we heard the central bank assessment with regard to the fact that for several months the banks have been in the black in terms of their profits. And our two leading government banks promised to us that the banking sector will go back to profit making in 2023. it would be nice to understand whether the central bank is going to continue recommending not to pay dividends in 2023, bearing in mind the fact that the payments from Bank to the government definitely would do some good. And my second question is about the conversion. We do know that some of the banks and the brokers effectively started this forceful currency conversion. So I would like to find out the central bank's position towards it. What is your attitude towards the situation where conditions for customers are being changed? And in one of its comments, the central bank stated that if this is being allowed by the new tariffs, and if customers had been notified preliminarily, then this could happen. But my question is, what is the period of time you believe is to be optimal to let this be a notice? Because one of the banks stated today, saying that our correspondent accounts as of October 1st doesn't work, and so until the end of the day of October 31st, taking out your US dollars will take just business day without considering this to be the evening of Friday. So you can't call this to be a sufficient notice. Well, thank you very much. As far as the banking system is concerned, the profitability of the banking system is recovering, and we expect that this trend will sustain throughout 2023. As far as the dividend policies are concerned, our recommendation for this year also was not to pay dividends, and that was issued to the banks which use our regulatory easing. But if they don't use such an easing and they have a profit and they can pay dividends, we will additionally review whether such recommendations should be kept for the future, because quite possibly there might not be any necessity towards it like the case was this year. Now, as far as the so-called forceful currency conversion is concerned, our position used to be and is that if this is not envisaged by contract, then the forceful conversion of currency into rubles must not occur. And the households and the customers must have a choice to either keep their savings in foreign currency by accepting risks and fees and whatnot, or either to convert it to rubles, because we actually note that households voluntarily are being very active in converting foreign currency issued by the countries which introduce sanctions either into rubles or into the currency of the friendly countries. But there must be such a choice offered. And you are correct in asking about the sufficient notice timing for such rules to be introduced either into the agreements or contracts or general rules, because we will be diligently monitoring this so that the households and customers might have sufficient and ample time to make a well-informed decision about such a thing. The next question comes from Tatiana Chubasu from Interfax. Tatiana, congratulate you on the birth of your daughter. Thank you very much. I've got two questions. The first is basically about the foreign bank subsidiaries. Several transactions have already been announced about the Eurosibs ones. One of these days, the Mercedes Bank announced that it's going to sell to the Russian investor some of the assets, including the Mercedes Bank. Now, has the central bank received any applications from a Russian investor to acquire such a bank, as well as have a permit been issued? Because it is in the list related to the presidential executive order. HSBC also has stated that it is not going to stop its attempts to sell its Russian subsidiaries. So how are the things without these transactions? The second question, a big outflow of the Russian citizens out of the country post-September 1st, hasn't it become a major macroeconomic factor? And has the central bank, in view of this, considered any additional restrictions to impose upon the cross-border transfers? As far as foreign banks' subsidiaries in Russia are concerned, and the
attempts by foreign banks to divest from. I don't have information about the first case that you asked, but in any case, we cannot issue a permit outside of the procedures set forth in the executive order, because all of the procedures that have been mentioned there are going to be complied with. Now, the second question, some of our citizens live in the country. No, we haven't considered to impose any additional restrictions upon the cross-border transfers because of that. Rita, please. Thank you very much. Again, Rita Shpilevskaya from TASS agency. Do you have an evaluation of the demand for the lending holidays for the mobilized citizens? How well that works? Has Central Bank received any complaints about it? We are gathering information, and we shall publish it on a monthly basis. We will publish the amount of restructured loans or the grace period that has been offered under the currently existing legislation. As far as the mechanism is concerned, we are monitoring the way it works together with the banks, so that the banks could demonstrate an understanding towards granting such grace period, because one of the circumstances was to present a power of attorney, and we explained to the banks that the power of attorney could be done in a simple form, in writing. Yes, we do receive calls. There have been about 300 complaints that so far we have received in our call center. There are some questions that people raise about how to better understand it, but in terms of any legal grievance, we will definitely be fully ready to get in touch with the banks in order to make sure that this mechanism works effectively. The next question from Elena Fabrichna, Reuters. Could you continue to reduce the key rate in December, or will it remain for a longer period of time? Alexei Borisovich, could you please take this? Well, I shall repeat what Elvira Nabiullina already mentioned, and she answered this question in one of the first Q&A points based on the results of today's board. There was a very broad consensus in terms of keeping the rate as is 7.5, as well as just simply sending a neutral signal. If we were to consider any significant probability of reducing the rate at any of the subsequent board meetings, we would have mentioned it in our press release. Thank you. The next question comes from Shenem Monkush, GTRK Tiva, Kuzil City. A lot of payments currently are taking place because of the special military operations. Will that affect the level of inflation? Generally speaking, we don't expect this to happen throughout the country. I mean, that it will impact inflation, because the payment in questions have started taking place within the budget spending format. Secondly, we don't see that the household who are receiving such payments would rush to get rid of it, because we see a greater propensity to save as a precaution. And so we do not see that such additional payments will create a pro-inflationary effect towards the end of the year. Of course, situation may differ depending upon the region and the level of incomes, but we will continue to monitor this. Next question online from Anna Kaledina from Izvestia newspaper. Yesterday, the president at the Valdai Club conference said that he sought the advice from the central bank and the government before his speech, and he now may state that the peak of the economic difficulties is behind us. Was that the advice given to him by the central bank? Do you agree that it is already behind us, and how can you argue for that? Well, indeed, the difficult things related to the economy adjusting itself to the kind of restrictions that had been previously introduced and initiated in spring, we see that this adaptation is taking place actively and better than our expectations, better than the expectations we used to have in summer or spring. But it doesn't mean that it's going to be easy further on, because we're facing difficult task of structural transformation, and of course external pressures remain, it may become stronger. We're very well aware of it, and so we are facing some difficult processes of the structural reorganization of the economy in order to make sure that it enters a sustainable and stable trajectory. The next question comes from online. Funny Money Media Product, Konstantin Tsigankov. Good afternoon and good evening, rather. I've got two quick questions. The first one, we used to have something of bank runs when people would draw cash. That occurred in February, and that occurred again in September 21st. So what does the central bank think about it as risks? Will the system be able to cope with the third bank run? God forbid, of course. And my third question, how would you comment the idea by the government to fund the budget deficit from the National Welfare Fund? I mean, against the frozen golden hard currency reserves and the impossibility to utilize the National Welfare Fund if you put more money into the economy. That is a free mission. So, yes, what's your take on this? As to the first question, I wouldn't describe it as a bank run, because usually a bank run is something when households cease to believe in the financial stability of specific banks. So those were slightly different phenomena, particularly in September, when people in many ways were taking their money from the banks. And because of this precautionary motivation, rather, and actually the bank run, the recent one, was not as intense as in February, because in February the banking system was able to really manage this demand for liquidity. It has managed now, and it continues to do so. Well, first of all, because the system is in the structural deficit and the surplus, and the banks know how to manage liquidity. If there's a need for it, they raise the deposit rates. We remember seeing it in February when the deposit rate really brought the money back into the banking system. And the risk data also shows that the money started coming back into the banking system again. Apart from it, the banks also have this certain support mechanisms, because they can get liquidity from the central bank as a collateral, and it's quite a big one. It's 9 trillion rubles worth. I mean, the securities and non-market assets as well. So whenever there's a need, using such standard instrument, the banks can get the necessary liquidity. So there is no question at all of whether the system can cope with the outflow of liquidity. What was the second question, please, Alexei Borisovich? Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, further adding to the first question, the biggest indicator that the system is coping well is that the money market rate remain close to the key one. That means that there is no squeeze on liquidity in the banking system. It gets the necessary flexibility in being able to manage its liquidity through our standard tool set. As far as the National Welfare Fund is concerned, I think there's a need for a broader kind of response. One should say that the impact of the fiscal policy upon inflation is being achieved through the fiscal policy in terms of the aggregate demand and the growth of the money mass, while the dynamic of the money mass is being affected by the aggregate indicator of the budget deficit. Using the welfare fund resources is just one of the methods to fund the shortages. So for the inflation forecast and our decisions with respect to the monetary policy, what's important is the trajectory of the structural deficit. And as it has been mentioned in the statement by the governor, we take into account the announced by the government fiscal rules in the form that it has been introduced into the parliament and into the budget. They have already been approved through the first reading by the Russian Parliament. We take into account in our forecast and the forecast trajectory of the key rate that has been published yet another time today, with the fiscal policy reflected in the budget. Inflation next year will be 5 to 7%, and so taking into account the current monetary policy, it will get back to the 4% level by 2024. And at the same time, Against the bigger amount of the budget deficit, once again, I would like to underscore that it's all about the deficit rather than specific way of funding it. The contribution by the budget into the demand dynamic and the money mass is going to be greater. And so in order to retain inflation within the same trajectory and bring it back to the 4% by 2024, are the kind of factors which may impact the demand for the money mass. I mean, the core ones in the money mass creation is the lending to the private sector and the lending into the economy. If the fiscal contribution is greater, then the lending into the economy contribution should be smaller. And so respectively, that might require a much tougher fiscal policy and higher levels of the key rate. But again, the kind of the forecast that we have in our hands fully relies upon the fiscal plans that the government has currently put together. Well, my dear colleagues, that was the last question. We've been able to fit ourselves exactly within 1 hour. Thank you very much.